Bobcat couldn't save her cub. You won't believe who came to the rescue. In the unforgiving wilderness of Montana's Northern Wilderness Reserve, where survival is dictated by the harsh rhythms of nature, humanity and wildlife cross paths in a tale of courage, compassion, and resilience. Ranger Eric Johnson, a veteran with decades of service, has dedicated his life to safeguarding the pristine landscapes and creatures of the reserve. But one fateful winter morning, his routine patrol takes a chilling turn when he discovers a helpless bobcat kitten trapped in an illegal poacher's snare. The rescue sets off a chain of events that exposes the growing menace of organized wildlife trafficking and tests the limits of Eric's resolve. As the narrative unfolds, the bond between Eric and the injured bobcats deepens, transcending the boundaries of their vastly different worlds. His commitment to protecting the animals leads him to a harrowing confrontation with the poachers who placed profits above preservation. Yet, amidst the brutal challenges of the wilderness, unexpected alliances form, proving that even in the darkest moments, acts of kindness and bravery can forge profound connections. This story is not merely an adventure. It's a tribute to the enduring spirit of both humans and the animals they strive to protect, showcasing the delicate balance between coexistence and survival in the wild. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or further refinement. During his regular morning patrol in the rugged Northern Wilderness Reserve of Montana, Ranger Eric Johnson heard a piercing cry that cut through the still, icy air. The sound sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Frost clung to the underbrush that day, and bitter winds whipped through the pines, scattering snow and reducing visibility to mere yards ahead. At 53, Eric was the most experienced ranger in the reserve. 27 years of service had etched lines into his weathered face and streaked his once dark hair with silver. Those same years had also sharpened his senses to the rhythms and disruptions of the wilderness he'd sworn to protect. Something was wrong. The cry he'd heard wasn't the ordinary sound of predator and prey. It carried desperation, a plea that transcended species. Eric followed the desperate cries, carefully navigating dense stands of lodgepole pines and uneven, frozen ground. His breath formed visible puffs in the air, mingling with the faint, urgent cries that grew louder as he approached a narrow canyon where Coldwater Creek meandered, now frozen solid beneath 6 inches of ice. The February morning was unforgiving, with temperatures hovering near zero, making every breath painful. There, wedged among rocks and ice, he discovered a cruelly set pit trap, its slick, frozen walls bearing fresh claw marks and tool scratches, a sign of deliberate tampering by poachers. Inside the trap, a small bobcat kitten was frantically clawing at the icy walls, its soft, spotted fur matted with frost, and its breath shallow and uneven. The kitten was clearly exhausted and suffering from hypothermia. "Easy now, little one," Eric murmured, though he knew his words meant nothing to the frightened animal. It was the tone he hoped might soothe, a gentle counterpoint to the cruelty the kitten had experienced. He knelt at the edge of the trap, his heart heavy with anger at the senseless cruelty. The trap was sophisticated, not the work of amateurs or opportunistic hunters, but organized poachers who trafficked in exotic pets or fur. Knowing that the kitten was in immediate danger, he quickly radioed for backup. "Johnson here. I've got an illegal trap with a bobcat kitten in distress at Coldwater Canyon, East Ridge. Appears to be hypothermic. Signs of professional poaching activity. Need assistance and rescue gear, ASAP." The radio crackled, and the voice of Dispatch Officer Sandra Williams responded immediately. "Copy that, Ranger Johnson. Sending Rangers Peterson and Miyamoto to your location. ETA 15 minutes. Eric settled in to wait, removing his outer jacket despite the biting cold and draping it over the pit to provide some shelter for the kitten from the wind. He knew better than to attempt a rescue alone. Wildlife in distress was unpredictable, and the mother bobcat was likely nearby and extremely agitated. As if confirming his thoughts, a low growl emanated from a snow-covered ridge about 30 yards away. There, partially concealed by a fallen pine, was the mother bobcat. She was a magnificent creature, with tawny fur marked by black spots and striking amber eyes that seemed to burn with both fury and desperation. She paced anxiously, but something was wrong with her movement. She favored her right hind leg significantly. Eric raised his binoculars and cursed under his breath. A snare was wrapped around her leg, cutting into the flesh. The poachers had set multiple traps, likely hoping to capture the entire family unit. Within minutes, fellow Rangers Mark Peterson and Jason Miyamoto arrived with appropriate rescue gear. Mark, a former wildlife veterinarian who joined the Rangers 5 years ago, quickly assessed the situation. "Damn poachers are getting bolder," Mark muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. At 38, he was built like a lumberjack, with broad shoulders and strong, capable hands that had saved countless wildlife over the years. "That's a Eurasian lynx snare on the mother. Not even legal to import. We're dealing with professionals." Jason, the youngest of the three at 29, nodded grimly. Fresh out of the University of Montana's wildlife biology program, he brought contemporary conservation knowledge to their team. "Those snares can cause permanent damage if not removed quickly. We need to get to both of them." They formulated a plan to extract the vulnerable kitten while keeping its stressed mother as calm as possible. Mark would descend into the pit to retrieve the kitten, while Eric would attempt to approach the mother once the kitten was secure. Mark carefully descended the icy cliff using a secured rope and pulley system that Jason anchored to a sturdy pine. His first few attempts to loop a soft restraint around the Bobcat kitten were met with difficulty. Loose ice and jagged edges threatened to worsen its injuries. But driven by urgency and the kitten's feeble cries, Mark finally managed to secure the loop around its small, shivering body. "Got it," Mark called up. "Start the lift gently." With steady, deliberate tugs, Eric and Jason helped hoist the fragile creature out of the pit, all the while monitoring its condition. Once the kitten was safely above ground, Mark followed, climbing the rope with practiced ease despite the cold that numbed fingers and slowed reflexes. Jason quickly examined the kitten, wrapping it in a thermal blanket designed specifically for wildlife rescue. Female, approximately 3 months old. Moderate hypothermia, but no visible broken bones. She's got some lacerations on her paws from trying to climb out, though. The kitten's eyes, a brilliant amber like her mother's, were glazed with fear and exhaustion. Her tiny body trembled violently, a combination of cold and terror. Meanwhile, Ranger Eric turned his attention to the mother bobcat, whose low, pained growls indicated severe distress. She was caught in a snare made of a steel cable that bit into her hind leg, cutting off circulation. The leg was swollen, and dried blood had frozen in her fur. Eric examined the snare with his multi-tool and noted that its lock was more sophisticated than standard equipment used in park traps, an ominous sign of organized poaching. As the distant rumble of unauthorized vehicles approached the reserve, Eric's concern deepened. "Someone's coming," Jason whispered, his hand instinctively moving toward the service weapon he carried but rarely used. Eric nodded grimly. "Likely our poachers, returning to check their traps. Mark, get the kitten back to the station and call on the situation. Jason, stay with me, but keep your distance. I don't want to spook either the bobcat or our unwelcome visitors." With time running short, Eric carefully secured the kitten in a thermal carrier and handed it to Mark, who hurried back toward their vehicles. Eric then turned his attention to the mother bobcat, approaching slowly with a tranquilizer gun at the ready. He'd prefer not to use it. Tranquilizers were risky in cold weather, as they could further lower body temperature. But the animal's safety came first. The mother bobcat watched him intently, her growls subsiding slightly, as if she understood his intent. Eric worked meticulously on the snare's lock, his fingers numb from the cold. Just then, muffled voices and the sound of snowmobiles grew louder. Through the swirling snow, Eric could make out the approaching shapes of 3 vehicles. "They're coming fast," Jason warned from his position 20 yards back. "We've got maybe 2 minutes." Eric increased his focus, feeling the delicate mechanism of the snare with fingertips that had long since lost sensation. One wrong move could tighten the snare further, potentially severing an artery in the bobcat's already compromised leg. The snowmobile's engines grew louder, then cut suddenly. Voices, harsh, urgent, and angry, carried through the crisp air. "Check the pit first," a gruff voice commanded. "That cub will fetch at least $5,000 from Rostov's people. And if Mama's still in the snare, that's another 10. Another voice replied with a chuckle that contained no humor, only greed. One of the poachers, a burly man with a noticeable scar running from his left eye to his jawline, emerged from the swirling snow, alerting his companions with a sharp shout when he spotted Eric. "We've got rangers," he bellowed, reaching for something inside his heavy coat. Realizing that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, Eric increased his focus. In the final moments of delicate work on the snare's mechanism, a sudden gust of wind kicked up a cloud of snow, briefly obscuring the scene. Seizing the opportunity, Eric managed to free the lock just as one of the poachers pointed his rifle toward their location. The tension peaked when the snare fell loose, and the mother bobcat, despite her injured leg, sprang to her feet. Though her movement was labored, she instinctively positioned herself between the poachers and Eric, emitting a powerful, warning snarl that seemed to echo through the canyon. The unexpected sight of the freed, though wounded, bobcat startled the poachers. Their aggressive shouts subsided as they hesitated, uncertain of how to proceed in the face of the animal's defiant stance. "Back off," Eric commanded, standing to his full height and unholstering his service weapon. "You're on protected federal land conducting illegal poaching activities. Jason, call it in." Taking advantage of the pause, the mother bobcat limped rapidly away, disappearing into the dense underbrush with remarkable speed considering her injury. The scarred poacher glared at Eric, his face contorted with rage. "You've cost me a lot of money today, Ranger," he spat. "This isn't over." "It is for now," Eric replied steadily, though his heart pounded against his ribs. "Leave your weapons and identification on the ground and step back." A tense standoff ensued, broken only when the wail of approaching sirens signaled that Mark had successfully called in reinforcements. The poachers exchanged glances, then quickly retreated to their snowmobiles, speeding away before Eric could stop them. "We've got their descriptions and vehicle information," Jason said, lowering his radio. "County Sheriff and State Police have been notified. They'll set up roadblocks." Eric nodded, but his gaze was fixed on the direction where the mother bobcat had disappeared. "Let's hope they catch them," he said quietly. "But right now, I'm more concerned about that mother. With that leg injury and the cold, her chances aren't good." Back at the Northern Wilderness Reserve Station, veterinarian Dr. Elaine Shin worked quickly to stabilize the bobcat kitten. The small creature's body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and frostbite threatened her paws and the tips of her ears. "She's a fighter," Dr. Chin remarked as she administered warmed fluids and gently cleaned the lacerations on the kitten's paws. At 45, Elaine had dedicated her career to wildlife medicine, often volunteering her services to the reserve when injured animals were brought in. Her steady hands and calm demeanor had saved countless lives over the years. The ranger station's medical facility was modest but well-equipped for wildlife emergencies. Under the warm glow of examination lights, the kitten's fur revealed a beautiful pattern of spots and stripes, unique as a fingerprint. "Does she have a chance?" Eric asked, watching the procedure from a respectful distance. He'd removed his snow-covered outer gear but hadn't taken the time to change his damp clothes or warm himself properly. His concern for the animals outweighed personal comfort. Elaine nodded cautiously. "If we can get her temperature stabilized and prevent infection in these cuts, yes." Bobcat kittens are remarkably resilient. But she's young, probably one of her first seasons without the full protection of her mother. "I'm more concerned about what happens if we can't reunite her with the mother." Mark, who had assisted Elaine with the initial examination, frowned. "Hand-raising is possible, but rehabilitation and release become complicated the longer they're in human care." Eric's weathered face showed his concern. "The mother got away, but she's injured. The snare did significant damage to her leg, and in these temperatures." He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the cruel mathematics of wilderness survival. An injured predator quickly becomes prey or succumbs to exposure and starvation. "I'm going back out," Eric announced, already reaching for his still damp coat. "The mother can't have gone far with that injury. If we can bring her in, we can treat both of them and eventually release them together." "Eric, it's nearly dark, and the temperature's dropping," Jason protested. "The forecast is calling for another 8 inches of snow overnight. It's too dangerous." But Eric's mind was made up. 27 years of ranging had taught him to trust his instincts, and something deep inside wouldn't let him abandon the mother bobcat to the elements. "I'll take the Northwest Quadrant vehicle. It has the thermal imaging equipment," he said. "If she's still moving, I'll find her. If not..." He left the grim alternative unspoken. Reserve Director Catherine Wilkins, who had been silently observing from the doorway, stepped forward. At 62, Catherine had the authority that came with decades of wildlife management experience and the political savvy to protect both the reserve and her rangers. "Take Jason with you," she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "And check in every 30 minutes. If you haven't found her in 2 hours, you come back. That's non-negotiable, Eric. I'm not losing rangers to frostbite or worse. Eric nodded, knowing better than to argue. Catherine's concern was valid. Rangers had died in similar conditions, their dedication to wildlife outweighing self-preservation. As Eric and Jason prepared to depart, Elaine called out, "If you find her, approach with extreme caution. She's in pain, frightened, and her maternal instincts will be in overdrive. Use the tranquilizer if necessary, but remember that hypothermia will compound its effects." With a final glance at the tiny kitten, now resting under warming lamps with intravenous fluids providing hydration, Eric headed out into the gathering darkness. The snowfall had intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond their vehicle's headlights. Eric drove slowly while Jason operated the thermal imaging equipment, scanning the trees and underbrush for any sign of body heat that might indicate the Bobcat. "Nothing yet," Jason reported after the first hour of searching. "We should expand the search perimeter. She might have moved faster than we anticipated, even with the injury." Eric nodded grimly, turning the reserve vehicle onto a narrow fire road that wound deeper into the forest. The silence between them was filled with the soft static of the radio and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the falling snow. "Wait, I've got something," Jason suddenly exclaimed, pointing to a faint heat signature on the thermal screen. About 50 yards east, near that rock outcropping. Eric carefully parked the vehicle and gathered their gear, tranquilizer gun, medical kit, and a specialized wildlife transport carrier. The snow had accumulated to need depth in some areas, making their progress slow and laborious. As they approached the location, Eric could make out a small cave-like formation created by fallen rocks and the exposed roots of an ancient pine. And there, barely visible in the shadows, were two glowing eyes. "It's her," Eric whispered, raising his hand to halt Jason's advance. "Stay back. I'll approach alone." The mother bobcat growled weakly, her injured leg held awkwardly to one side. Even in the dim light, Eric could see that the leg had swollen considerably, and the animal's movements were sluggish, signs of advancing hypothermia and shock. "Easy, girl," Eric murmured, slowly retrieving a package of raw venison from his pack, an emergency ration they carried for just such occasions. He tossed small pieces toward the bobcat, each one a little closer to where he stood. The animal's instincts warred visibly, hunger and survival against fear and distrust. Finally, hunger won out. She cautiously sniffed at the meat, then devoured it quickly. Eric continued the process, gradually decreasing the distance between them. When he was about 10 feet away, he prepared the tranquilizer gun, knowing he would have only one chance. "I'm sorry," he whispered, taking careful aim. "This will help you, I promise." The dart found its mark with precision, striking the bobcat's shoulder. She snarled and retreated further into the small cave, but within minutes, her movements became uncoordinated as the sedative took effect. Once she was fully sedated, Eric and Jason worked quickly to assess her injuries and stabilize her for transport. "The leg looks bad," Jason noted, gently examining the wound left by the snare. "But the circulation isn't completely compromised. Dr. Chen might be able to save it." Eric nodded, carefully lifting the sedated bobcat into the transport carrier. Despite her injured state, he was struck by her beauty, the perfect adaptation of form to function, the wilderness embodied in muscle and fur and fierce protective instinct. "Let's get her back," he said softly. "Her kitten is waiting." For the next 2 weeks, the ranger station's medical facility became a round-the-clock operation. Dr. Chen performed surgery on the mother bobcat's leg, removing damaged tissue and carefully repairing blood vessels and tendons that had been nearly severed by the snare. "It's remarkable," she told Eric during one of his daily visits to check on the bobcats. "In most cases, an injury this severe would require amputation. But she's healing at an extraordinary rate. Wild animals often surprise us with their resilience." The mother and kitten had been reunited after the first 3 days, once the mother was stable enough and the kitten's condition had improved. Their reunion had been a moment of pure grace amidst the clinical setting, the mother gently grooming her offspring, both animals visibly relaxing in each other's presence. Eric found himself drawn to the recovery area more often than his duties strictly required. Something about these particular animals resonated with him, perhaps because he'd witnessed both the worst of human cruelty toward them and their remarkable will to survive. "You've adopted them, haven't you?" Catherine teased gently when she found Eric sitting quietly near their enclosure one evening, simply observing the pair. Eric smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" "You've always been too soft-hearted for your own good," she replied, but her tone held affection rather than criticism. "Just remember, they're wild animals, not pets. Our job is to get them strong enough to return to their natural habitat." "I know," Eric sighed, "but I can't help thinking about those poachers. They're still out there. The sheriff's office hasn't had any luck tracking them down." Catherine's expression grew serious. "About that, we've received reports of similar traps being found in the eastern section of the reserve. Same sophisticated design, same targeting of predator species. Fish and Wildlife Service is involved now. They believe it's part of a larger trafficking operation." Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. For the next 2 months, he remained vigilant during his patrols, particularly in areas known to have bobcat populations. He knew the poachers would likely seek retribution for disrupting their operation, both against the wildlife and potentially against him personally. Strange snowmobile tracks began appearing near his patrol routes, and he often felt the unnerving sensation of being watched. Yet, he never regretted his actions. The memory of the bobcat kitten's amber eyes, now filled with a glimmer of trust, motivated him to continue protecting the reserve with renewed dedication. As spring began to soften the Montana landscape, the time came to release the bobcats back into the wild. Dr. Chin had removed the mother's sutures, and both animals had regained their strength and wild instincts during their recovery. "They're ready," she informed Eric and Catherine during the final assessment. "The mother's leg has healed remarkably well. She'll always have a slight limp, but it won't impair her hunting or survival." The release was scheduled for dawn the following day, in a remote area of the reserve far from hiking trails and known poaching activity. Eric volunteered to handle the transport himself, wanting to complete the journey he'd begun on that frigid February morning. As he loaded the special carrier into his vehicle before sunrise, he felt a mixture of emotions: joy at returning the animals to their rightful home, concern for their ongoing safety, and a strange sense of loss. These creatures had become symbols to him, reminders of why his work mattered. The drive to the release site took nearly 2 hours, winding through mountain roads now muddy with spring thaw. Eric chose a sheltered clearing near a stream, an ideal bobcat habitat with plentiful prey and good cover. With methodical care, he positioned the carrier and opened its door, then retreated to a respectful distance. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, cautiously, the mother bobcat emerged, her amber eyes surveying the surroundings with wild alertness. The kitten, no longer tiny, but not yet full-grown, followed close behind, mirroring her mother's cautious movements. The pair paused at the edge of the clearing, the mother's nose testing the air. Then, with a final glance in Eric's direction that he could have sworn held recognition, they slipped into the underbrush and disappeared. Eric stood motionless for a long time, watching the place where they had vanished. "Stay safe," he whispered finally, before turning back toward his vehicle. Unknown to Eric, his actions had not gone unnoticed. The scarred poacher, whose name was Victor Kruger, had indeed been tracking the ranger's movements. A former guide turned to illegal trafficking, Kruger had lost significant income when Eric interrupted their operation. The bobcat and her kitten would have brought premium prices in the black market exotic pet trade, and the mother's pelt would have fetched thousands from collectors. Kruger had spent weeks planning his revenge, watching patrol patterns and learning the reserve's less monitored areas. He had recruited 3 others, men with few scruples and substantial debts, for what he described as a simple lesson in consequence. One frigid morning in early April, while on a routine patrol in a secluded section of the reserve, Eric discovered fresh cigarette butts and boot prints near an area he rarely monitored. The tracks were recent, disturbing the spring mud without being washed away by the intermittent rain. Before he could radio for backup, a warning shot, non-lethal, meant to scare, rang out through the silent forest. Ducking behind a sturdy pine, Eric saw 4 figures emerge from the misty tree line, armed and determined. Among them was Kruger, his scarred face twisted in anger. "Thought you could interfere with our work?" Kruger barked, signaling his team to surround Eric. "Those cats were worth 20 grand, Ranger. And since we can't collect from them, we'll have to find another way to settle the debt." A sharp blow to Eric's back sent him tumbling into the mud, and rough ropes quickly bound his wrists as his radio and service weapon were discarded into a nearby thicket. Forced to march deeper into the wilderness, Eric's thoughts raced, calculating distances and possibilities. The nearest ranger station was 12 miles away. His absence wouldn't be noted as unusual for hours yet. The men marched him to a dilapidated hunting cabin, a relic from before the area was designated as a federal reserve. Inside, the musty air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies. "You've cost us jobs and money," Kruger said, pacing the cabin's uneven floorboards. Do you have any idea how many people rely on the trade you're so righteously protecting animals from? Not everyone has a cushy government job with benefits. Poaching endangered species isn't a job, Eric replied steadily. It's a crime, and it destroys the very resources that legitimate businesses in this region depend on. Kruger's response was a backhanded blow that split Eric's lip. Save the conservation lecture. We're going to leave you out here for a few days to think about the consequences of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Maybe a taste of what real survival feels like will adjust your perspective. With that, Kruger and his men secured Eric to a support beam in the cabin, leaving only a single canteen of water within reach of his bound hands. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of their vehicles faded into the distance. Eric assessed his situation with the calm logic that had served him through nearly 3 decades in the wilderness. The ropes were tight but hastily tied. With time and patience, he might work himself free. The real concerns were exposure. April nights in Montana still dropped below freezing, and the possibility that Kruger and his men might return with more permanent intentions. Hours passed as Eric methodically worked at his bindings, ignoring the pain in his wrists and the growing chill as daylight faded. Just as he managed to create some slack in the ropes, a new sound caught his attention, the soft, deliberate patting of paws on the cabin's wooden porch. Eric froze, listening intently. Montana's forests housed numerous predators, wolves, mountain lions, bears now emerging from hibernation. Any might be attracted to the scent of blood from his split lip or the lingering odors left by Kruger and his men. The door of the cabin, left unlatched, creaked slowly open. Eric's breath caught in his throat as a familiar tawny form slipped inside, the mother bobcat, her movement still marked by the slight limp, her amber eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight filtering through the cabin's dirty windows. "Well, hello there," Eric whispered, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. The bobcat's presence here, miles from where he'd released her, defied explanation. The animal approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as she processed the complex scents in the cabin. She circled Eric once, then again, before settling directly before him, her gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus. Then, as if arriving at some decision, she moved closer and began to gnaw at the ropes binding his wrists. "Thank you," Eric murmured, remaining perfectly still to avoid startling her. Her teeth, evolved for tearing flesh from bone, made quick work of the fibers. Within minutes, the ropes fell away, allowing Eric to bring his numbed hands forward and rub circulation back into them. The bobcat retreated a few paces, watching him with that same unnerving focus. When Eric slowly rose to his feet, she moved toward the door, then looked back at him expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Eric asked, knowing the question was absurd yet unable to interpret her behavior any other way. Outside, the forest had darkened considerably, making navigation treacherous. The bobcat paused frequently, ensuring Eric kept pace despite his stiffness from hours of confinement. She led him not toward the reserve station, which lay southeast, but northwest, deeper into the wilderness. After nearly an hour of walking, they arrived at a small clearing where the remains of a recent kill, a mule deer, provided evidence of successful hunting. And there, emerging from a hollow beneath a fallen log, came the younger bobcat, now nearly grown but still recognizable as the kitten Eric had rescued. The younger cat approached more cautiously than her mother, circling wide before her curiosity overcame caution. She sniffed at Eric's boots, then his outstretched hand, before seemingly accepting his presence. "You two are doing well, I see," Eric said softly, overwhelmed by the realization that these wild creatures had not only survived but thrived, and somehow, against all logic, remembered him. The moment of connection was shattered by the distant sound of vehicles approaching, the distinctive growl of Kruger's modified four-wheelers. The poachers had returned, likely discovering Eric's escape from the cabin. The mother bobcat's ears flattened at the sound, her body tensing visibly. Her kitten retreated immediately to the safety of their den, but the mother stood her ground, looking from Eric to the direction of the approaching vehicles. "You should hide," Eric told her, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "This is my fight, not yours." But the bobcat seemed to have other ideas. As the four-wheelers drew nearer, she trotted purposefully toward the sound, her limp more pronounced with her hurried gait. Eric followed, concern overriding caution. Through the trees, he could see Kruger and his men dismounting, rifles in hand. "He can't have gotten far," Kruger was saying. "Spread out. Check the game trails. He'll be heading for the station." Then, as if summoned by his own desperate hope, the mother bobcat appeared. Emerging steadily from the gathering shadows, Her muscular form moved with determination despite her injury. Her amber eyes met those of the poachers, and her presence halted their advance. The men's expressions shifted from determination to uncertainty. "Shoot it," one of the poachers urged, raising his rifle. "Wait," Kruger countered, his voice betraying uncertainty. "Something's not right." Taking advantage of the distraction, the bobcat advanced, her claws crunching in the fallen leaves and spring mud. She emitted a growl that seemed impossibly loud for an animal her size, the sound primitive and charged with threat. In the ensuing chaos, one of the poachers panicked and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle spooked their vehicle's motors, causing one four-wheeler to lurch forward unmanned, crashing into a tree with a metallic crunch. The sight of the enraged bobcat, combined with the machinery failure, caused the poachers to break formation. 3 of them scattered, dropping their weapons and crashing through the underbrush toward the relative safety of the road. Only Kruger remained, his scarred face contorted with rage as he raised his rifle toward the bobcat. "Damned animal," he snarled. "Should have killed you when I had the chance." Eric, seeing the man's intention, burst from his concealment. "Federal agent," he shouted, using the formal declaration that carried legal weight. "Lower your weapon." Kruger swung the rifle toward Eric, momentary surprise giving way to cold calculation. "Two problems solved at once," he muttered, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot never came. In a blur of tawny fur and focused aggression, the bobcat launched herself at Kruger, not to maul or kill, but to disrupt. Her weight against his arm sent the rifle discharging harmlessly into the ground, and the shock of her attack caused him to stumble backward, losing his balance and crashing heavily to the forest floor. The bobcat sprang away as quickly as she had attacked, retreating to a safe distance while Kruger scrambled to regain his footing. Before he could recover, Eric was upon him, his ranger training taking over as he subdued the poacher with practiced efficiency. Using Kruger's own belt, Eric secured the man's wrists behind his back. "Victor Kruger, you're under arrest for illegal poaching, criminal trespass on federal lands, assault on a federal officer, kidnapping, and conspiracy," Eric recited, the formal words steady despite his racing heart. Kruger's only response was a stream of profanity, cut short when Eric confiscated a radio from the man's jacket and used it to call for assistance, giving their coordinates to Kruger's fleeing accomplices, who would find rangers rather than their leader waiting at their rendezvous point. With Kruger secured, Eric turned his attention back to the bobcat. She sat calmly at the edge of the clearing, grooming a paw as if the confrontation had been nothing more extraordinary than a spring shower. "Thank you," Eric said simply, the words inadequate for what had transpired between them. The bobcat paused in her grooming, regarding him with those intelligent amber eyes. Then, with deliberate grace, she rose and padded into the forest, disappearing among the trees with her characteristic silent efficiency. 2 hours later, when Rangers Mark and Jason arrived with local law enforcement to take Kruger into custody, Eric recounted the improbable sequence of events. If not for the physical evidence, the broken ropes, the crashed four-wheeler, Kruger himself in restraints, they might have dismissed it as concussion-induced fantasy. "You're saying the same bobcat you rescued recognized you and led you to safety?" Mark asked incredulously. "And then helped you apprehend an armed poacher?" Eric smiled, touching the split lip that was now swollen and tender. "I know how it sounds, but there's more intelligence in these animals than we give them credit for. And maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said for kindness being remembered." In the months that followed, the case against Kruger and his poaching ring brought to light an extensive network of illegal wildlife trafficking that extended across 3 states and into Canada. The evidence seized led to dozens of arrests and the rescue of numerous exotic animals bound for illegal collections. Eric gave testimony at the trial, his account of the bobcat's intervention raising eyebrows but ultimately being accepted due to his impeccable service record and reputation for honesty. Kruger received a 15-year sentence for his crimes, effectively ending his poaching career. As for the bobcats, they were spotted occasionally by rangers on patrol, always at a distance, always watching with those remarkable amber eyes before melting back into the wilderness that was their true home. Eric continued his patrols, his bond with the reserve and its wildlife deepened by his experience. On quiet mornings, he would sometimes stop at the clearing where he had last seen the mother bobcat and her now adult offspring. Though they rarely revealed themselves, he often had the sense that they were near, silently observing, fellow guardians of the wilderness they all called home. In ranger training sessions, he began emphasizing not just the science of wildlife management, but the deeper wisdom of respect for the intrinsic value of each species. "We protect them not just because laws require it, or because they maintain ecological balance, he would tell new recruits, but because they deserve to exist on their own terms, in their own wild way. Because sometimes, when we protect them, they protect us in return. The seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, painting the northern wilderness reserve with the brilliant gold of autumn, then the stark white of winter, before the tender greens of spring emerged once more. Time softened the sharper edges of Eric's memories, but the amber eyes of the mother bobcat remained vivid in his dreams. On a crisp morning in late September, nearly 18 months after the Kruger incident, Eric stood at the edge of Coldwater Canyon, surveying the area where he'd first found the trapped kitten. The air carried the scent of pine and the first hints of winter's approach. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his boots as he made notes on seasonal wildlife movements for the reserve's records. Movement in the distance caught his eye, a flash of tawny fur against the russet backdrop of early fall foliage. Eric lowered his binoculars and waited, his breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. His patience was rewarded when not one, but 3 bobcats emerged into a small clearing. The mother, now showing more gray around her muzzle, her offspring from that fateful winter, now fully grown, and something unexpected, a new set of kittens. Small and wobbling, their spotted coats pristine in the morning light. "Well, I'll be," Eric whispered, his weathered face breaking into a smile that reached his eyes. "You've got a family now." The adult offspring, the kitten he had rescued, had clearly mated and produced kittens of her own, continuing the lineage that had nearly been extinguished by human greed. The sight filled Eric with a profound sense of rightness, a completion of something that had begun in pain but transformed into renewal. The mother bobcat paused, lifting her head as if sensing his presence. For a moment, those amber eyes found his across the distance that separated their worlds. She didn't flee or display the typical wariness wild predators show toward humans. Instead, she sat, her tail curled around her paws, watching him with what Eric could only describe as recognition. "Thank you," he murmured, though the words couldn't possibly bridge the divide between them. That evening, back at the ranger station, Eric found himself unusually reflective as he completed his daily reports. The sighting had stirred something in him, a sense of purpose renewed, but also questions about the connections that formed between seemingly different beings when circumstances thrust them together. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Catherine observed, setting a mug of coffee on his desk. At 64 now, she had delayed her retirement, unwilling to leave the reserve until she was certain it would be in capable hands. The lines around her eyes had deepened, but her gaze remained sharp as ever. "Not a ghost," Eric replied. "Life. New life." He described the bobcat family, the way the mother had acknowledged him, the miracle of seeing the rescued kitten grown and with offspring of her own. Catherine listened, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said when he had finished, "I've been managing wildlife for 40 years, and there are still moments that defy everything we think we know about animal behavior. Those moments keep me humble." Eric nodded, grateful that Catherine, of all people, understood the significance of what he'd witnessed. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing them. If we hadn't found that trap." "But you did find it," Catherine reminded him. "That's what matters. And whatever connection formed between you and that bobcat, however unlikely it seems, it's real. I've seen enough in my career to know that some things can't be explained by science alone." The conversation lingered in Eric's mind as he drove home that evening to his modest cabin on the edge of the reserve. The structure was simple but sturdy, built by his own hands over several summers when he first joined the ranger service. Its wide porch faced west, offering views of sunsets that never failed to remind him why he'd chosen this life. Inside, photographs chronicled his years of service, wildlife rescues, conservation projects, the changing seasons of Montana's wilderness. Among them, prominently displayed, was a photo Mark had taken during the bobcat kitten's rehabilitation, Eric sitting quietly beside the enclosure, the mother and kitten watching him with unmistakable focus. He ran a finger along the frame, remembering. Then his gaze fell on a newer edition, a newspaper clipping announcing Victor Kruger's denied parole. The man's mugshot showed a face hardened by incarceration but still bearing that distinctive scar. The article mentioned that evidence from Kruger's case had led to the dismantling of wildlife trafficking operations in 3 countries. One life saved, Eric thought. One small bobcat kitten, pulled from a pit trap in winter. And the ripples spread outward, touching so many others. The next morning dawned with the first significant snowfall of the season. 6 inches of fresh powder transformed the landscape overnight, muffling sounds and softening edges. Eric's patrol route took him through the eastern section of the reserve, an area popular with day hikers even in colder weather. The visitor center radio crackled to life as he checked in from a remote lookout point. "Johnson, are you near Falcon Ridge Trail?" It was Jason's voice, tense with controlled urgency. "About 2 miles east," Eric replied. "What's happening?" "We've got a search and rescue situation." 8-year-old boy separated from his family near the upper ridge. Been missing about 40 minutes. Father tried to find him, got disoriented in the snow. "We've got teams mobilizing, but you're closest." Eric's mind immediately calculated the risks. 40 minutes in these temperatures, a child likely unprepared for sudden weather changes, unfamiliar terrain, the potential for panic leading to poor decisions. Not a worst-case scenario yet, but one that could quickly deteriorate. "I'm heading there now," he responded, already turning toward the trailhead. "Send coordinates to my GPS. Any medical conditions I should know about?" "Mother says he's healthy, but he's without his coat." They were taking pictures when the snow started, and he wandered off to explore while they were packing up. The drive to Falcon Ridge Trailhead took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Eric gathered his emergency pack, thermal blankets, first aid supplies, extra clothing, warm liquids in insulated containers, and communications equipment. Standard procedure was to wait for the full search team, but with temperatures dropping and a child at risk, procedure took second place to urgency. Families huddled in the small warming hut at the trailhead, their planned day of hiking transformed into anxious waiting. A thin, pale woman with dark hair pulled into a messy bun rushed toward Eric as he approached. "Are you with search and rescue?" she asked, voice trembling. "My son, Tyler, he just wanted to see a deer up close." I only looked away for a minute. Her words dissolved into a sob. "MS." Eric gently prompted. "Larson. Rebecca Larson." She straightened, visibly fighting for composure. "My husband Mark tried to follow Tyler's tracks, but then it started snowing harder and—" "We'll find him," Eric assured her with a confidence born of experience. "Tyler knows you're looking for him, and that's important. Kids usually don't go as far as we think. Can you show me where you last saw him?" Rebecca led Eric to a lookout point about a quarter-mile up the trail. "We were here, taking photos of the valley. Tyler said he saw something move in those trees." She pointed to a dense stand of pines about 50 yards off the main trail. "When I turned back from packing the camera, he was gone." Eric scanned the area, noting the trampled snow that indicated the initial search. Fresh snowfall had already begun to obscure any tracks, complicating matters significantly. He pulled out his radio to check on the status of the full search team, learning they were still 15 minutes away. "I'm going to start looking now," he told Rebecca. "The others will join soon, but time matters in these conditions." She nodded, eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "Find him, please." Eric began a systematic search, moving in expanding circles from the point where Tyler was last seen. He called the boy's name, listening intently after each call for any response. The snow continued to fall, thick flakes that reduced visibility and muffled sound. The temperature had dropped further, hovering now at 20 degrees with a wind chill that bit through even his insulated gear. 30 minutes into the search, with no sign of Tyler, Eric's concern deepened. The full team had arrived and spread out along predetermined routes, but the snowfall was quickly erasing any trail the boy might have left. 8 years old, no coat. In these temperatures, the situation was becoming critical. It was then, as Eric paused to check his compass and radio the team his position, that he noticed the tracks. They weren't human footprints, but the distinctive paw prints of a bobcat, fresh enough to be visible through the recent snowfall. Something about their purposeful direction caught his attention. Eric hesitated, torn between following standard search protocol and a gut feeling that tugged at him with surprising strength. 27 years of wilderness experience had taught him to trust his instincts. "Johnson checking in," he radioed. "I'm following a possible lead at the northeast quadrant of Section 4. We'll update in 10 minutes. He followed the tracks, moving deeper into the forest where the snow lay thinner beneath the canopy of pine branches. The bobcat's trail was clear, deliberate, almost like it wanted to be followed. After about 5 minutes, Eric noticed a second set of tracks joining the first, smaller, but with the same distinctive pattern. The mother and her offspring, moving together with purpose. And then, barely discernible in the fading light, a third set of tracks, small human footprints, partially filled with fresh snow. Eric's heart rate quickened. He moved faster now, following the intermingled tracks up a small rise and down into a sheltered hollow. There, in the gathering shadows of early winter dusk, he saw them. The mother bobcat sat at the entrance to a small natural enclosure formed by fallen logs and overhanging rock. Her offspring sat nearby, alert and watching. And within the shelter, Curled into a tight ball for warmth was a small figure in a blue sweater, Tyler. For a moment, Eric stood frozen, not trusting his eyes. The bobcats didn't flee at his approach. Instead, the mother rose and stepped aside, as if she had been waiting for him specifically. "Tyler," Eric called softly, approaching with measured steps. The boy's head jerked up, his face pale with cold, but his eyes clear. "Are you a ranger?" he asked, voice small but steady. "I am," Eric confirmed, kneeling beside him and quickly assessing his condition. Cold, frightened, but remarkably alert, no signs of severe hypothermia. "I'm Ranger Johnson. Your parents are very worried about you." "I got lost," Tyler said, the words catching on a sob. "I saw a deer, but then I couldn't find the trail, and it was snowing, and I was scared. But then they found me." He pointed to the bobcats, who maintained their distance but hadn't retreated. "They stayed with you?" Eric asked carefully, wrapping a thermal blanket around the boy's shoulders. Tyler nodded vigorously. "The big one led me here where it's dry. They stayed right there the whole time, like they were guarding me." "Are they your pets?" Eric smiled, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't fully name. "No, they're wild bobcats. They live here in the forest." He didn't try to explain further, knowing how incredible the truth would sound. Instead, he radioed the search team with the good news, giving their coordinates and requesting assistance for the return journey. As they waited, Eric shared his thermos of hot chocolate with Tyler, who sipped gratefully while casting curious glances at the bobcats. The animals remained nearby, watching with their characteristic intensity. "They're pretty," Tyler observed. "My teacher said wild animals are dangerous and we should stay away." "That's usually very good advice," Eric agreed. "Wild animals need their space, and most would run from humans or might become scared and defensive if cornered. So why didn't these ones run away? Why did they help me?" Eric looked at the mother bobcat, meeting those amber eyes that had haunted his dreams. There was wisdom there, and something else, a knowing that transcended the expected boundaries between species. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "animals surprise us. They see things we don't, understand things we can't explain. Maybe these bobcats knew you needed help, the same way they know when their own young need them." The search team arrived minutes later, breaking through the trees with flashlights and relief evident in their voices. Tyler's father was with them, rushing forward to sweep his son into a tight embrace. The commotion finally proved too much for the bobcats, who melted away into the forest with their characteristic silent efficiency. Only Eric noticed their departure, offering a small nod of thanks as they vanished. He felt certain this was no coincidence. The same bobcats he had rescued had somehow recognized a child in danger and chosen to intervene, just as they had when Eric himself faced peril from Kruger. The incident made local news. Lost boy kept safe by wild bobcats until rescue. Wildlife biologists offered various explanations: territorial behavior misinterpreted as protection, coincidental proximity, the sheltered location being a known bobcat rest area. None of the explanations satisfied Eric, but he kept his deeper thoughts to himself, knowing some connections defied scientific categorization. 2 days later, he returned to the site alone, carrying a small package wrapped in waterproof material. Inside was a carefully butchered venison haunch, the finest he could procure, free from any chemicals or processing. He placed it at the entrance to the hollow where Tyler had been found, then retreated to a respectful distance. He didn't have to wait long. The mother bobcat appeared silently from between the trees, limping slightly more pronouncedly than before, age beginning to compound her old injury. She approached the offering cautiously, sniffed it thoroughly, then looked directly at Eric. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the boy. For everything." She held his gaze for a long moment, then took the venison in her powerful jaws and disappeared into the forest, leaving Eric with the certainty that some bonds transcended the boundaries humans tried to impose on the natural world. Wild remained wild, yet connection remained possible, not through dominance or domestication, but through mutual respect and the rare, precious moments when different worlds touched in understanding. In the years that followed, Eric would occasionally glimpse the bobcat family from a distance, the mother growing grayer, the offspring establishing territories of their own, new generations of kittens learning to hunt and survive. He never approached them directly, honoring their wildness. But sometimes, when he patrolled the boundaries where wilderness and humanity met, he would sense her watching, an unseen guardian acknowledging a fellow protector of the land they shared. And on cold winter nights, when the stars burned like ice above his cabin, Eric would think of amber eyes and unlikely rescues, of connections formed through compassion rather than command. In those moments, the artificial separation between human and wild seemed to dissolve, revealing a deeper truth, that kindness, once offered freely, could return in ways no science could predict and no words could adequately describe. It was a truth he carried into his retirement years, when he moved from active ranger duty to education and advocacy. To skeptical audiences, he would tell the story of a bobcat who couldn't save her cub alone, and how that moment of human intervention had rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could have foreseen. Some doubted, some wondered, but in the faces of children especially, Eric saw recognition of the possibility that the natural world might hold more wisdom and connection than adults typically acknowledged. The wilderness doesn't need us, he would tell them, but sometimes we need it. And sometimes, when we protect what is wild protects us in return. Simple words for a complex truth that courage, compassion, and connection could transcend species, creating bonds as unexpected as they were profound, as fleeting as they were eternal.